ahead and get started. Folks might join us, and we're also recording this today so that we can have it posted for people that'll watch it later. So welcome, whether you're here right now with us in real time, or if you're joining this webinar later on when you're looking at the recording. I'm Kristen Poppleton, and I'm the Director of Programs here at Climate Generation, and I'm joined by...
I'm Sarah Goodspeed, and I'm our Youth and Policy Manager here at Climate Generation.
And we are psyched to have you all with us today to learn a little bit more about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties, otherwise known as COP, the role that our organization plays with the COP, and our plans for participating this year. I'm going to start things off by reminding everyone, let's see if I can move forward on our slide here, there we go, that we are currently in the middle of 24 hours of reality through Climate Reality, and our organization is joining in with others around the globe right now in making sure that climate change is being talked about and being communicated out into the world. And so here organizationally, 10 staff have actually been trained through the Climate Reality program, and the most recent training for Climate Reality was actually held here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where our organization is based. And we were really honored to be able to share a workshop for the 1,000 attendees on the importance of climate storytelling and helping people find their personal climate story. So we're proud to partner on this day when people around the world are focusing on communicating climate change. So as I mentioned, we'll be talking today about COP25 more specifically, and our delegation, and Sarah, our Youth and Policy Manager, will be digging more into it. Before we go there, general overview, we'll be talking about COP. We'll be focusing in a little bit more on the role that climate change plays as a driver of migration, and also how this really impacts things at an international climate negotiations level, and the role of Indigenous and Latinx communities and their voices, and this particular delegation this year. Climate Generation, if you're not familiar with us, was founded by polar explorer Will Steger out of his concern for climate change. And his story really is woven into our DNA of our organization, reminding us that, that we can all be eyewitness, and we all are eyewitness to this issue, and we all have a story to tell. Our mission is to empower individuals and their communities to engage in solutions to climate change, and we do this through engaging different sectors on the issue. We work with youth here throughout the state of Minnesota, empowering, engaging, and lifting up a network of youth leaders to organize around this issue and the intersectional issues that connect with climate change. We work with educators around the country, providing them with training and resources to teach climate change in their classrooms, whether they be science or social studies or English language arts teachers. We work with communities throughout the state and occasionally throughout the country, giving them voice, giving them the opportunity to tell their story, connecting them with resources on climate change. And we work with influencers, folks that really can take leadership on this issue. And we see influentials not just as elected leaders as is seen in this picture, but also as people who are leaders in their space. An example, really this weekend, we worked to put on a musical show, and at that show we empowered musicians and singers and songwriters that are respected to tell their climate story. And this was an opportunity for people to take next step as a leader in that space when they hadn't before, and to have their fans hear them taking that, so to influence them. And with that, I'm going to change it and move it over to Sarah, our fabulous Sarah, to talk a little bit more about COP and what we're planning. Take it away, Sarah.
Thank you, Kristen.
I will step out of the limelight here.
And so thank you again, all who are watching this webinar today or wherever you are. And so again, having Climate Generation root a lot of our work in storytelling is really important to the way that we come to the issues that we work on and the way that we work with communities. And so I'll share a little bit about my climate story and what brings me into this work, then the way that I've seen climate change. I am born and raised in Minnesota and have deep roots in the agricultural sector here through many generations of my ancestors. And I am also rooted in California through the other half of my family. And coming from Minnesota to California, where I went to college, kind of had a chip on my shoulder about our agricultural sector, which of course is a fraction of the kind of production they are able to create in California. And so I got really connected with a lot of farm workers and frontline advocates there at that time when I was really growing politically and professionally. And then I also began my professional career in Ecuador doing development as a Peace Corps volunteer. And so I worked with farm workers again in rural communities. That's me in the brown shirt with a number of extension educators in a really small town where we lived up in the Andes Mountains. And doing this work in communities that are so deeply affected by climate change, being a rural community and being an agricultural community are incredibly connected to the land and sensitive to the climate and the way that it's plays out in that landscape and in their economy and capacity. So it was really powerful to be able to take those lessons into this work here at Climate Generation. In Ecuador, I lived on the Pan American Highway, and it was really powerful when COP was announced this year. Originally was going to be in Brazil and then in Chile, and we'll talk about that later. But it's still a Latin American theme, a Latin American presidency. And so a lot of our work is really looking at what are our Pan American commitments to work collaboratively across this region. And so that's a lens that I'll be bringing to COP for Climate Generation. Thank you. So again, Climate Generation really is rooted in education. And so some of the facts that we root our work in is that climate change is real, it's undeniable, there's scientific consensus, it is already happening, and that humans are causing it. We acknowledge that climate change is urgent. We have 10 years to really curb our emissions that are causing global warming before it is almost beyond our control. But the great news is that we have solutions, and we're already on track towards those shifts that we really need to create. So going to COP, first of all, a little background is that the United Nations has agreed to work together to provide a global response to climate change. And that's done through the Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as the UNFCCC. And so this organization is the decision-making body that presides over the Convention of Parties, also known as COP. And so every year, the COP is where the UN brings together parties and civil society from across the world to come together and discuss solutions to climate change that we will collaboratively and collectively move towards. So this annual meeting is held in a different country every year to look at where we are as a globe and to make decisions on where we need to go and how we'll get there. And so every year, thousands of delegates participate in these meetings, and Climate Generation is one of those. This will be our 10th year participating at a COP, and this is COP25, so this is the 25th COP that is being held. So Climate Generation has sent multi-sector delegations throughout the years, including delegations of educators, delegations of youth, delegations of business representatives, government officials, and other nonprofit and advocacy partners, as well as youth delegates that really span the different audiences that we work with regularly. Thank you. And so some of the goals, again, just to take a really large overview, the COPs really are looking at our global emissions and how we can collectively lower those to a manageable level that will make this Earth survivable for everybody. And so part of that is looking at data and research that shows where those emissions are coming from and can help pinpoint who can take the lead on some of the solutions that we really need. So in 2015 at COP21, the Paris Agreement was a really significant outcome where almost every nation in the world agreed to work together to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And so there are almost 200 parties to the Paris Agreement who have signed on agreeing to collectively work towards those goals. And so that includes looking at the different sources of emissions across our economies and identifying how each country or each party to the agreement will commit to reducing those emissions by working within their own sectors to reduce those emissions. So in the US, for those of you, I think everyone on the call now is based in the US, our commitments, currently our president has signaled that the US will, as a federal agency, has begun withdrawal proceedings from the Paris Agreement. But nonetheless, we have local actors who are going to maintain that commitment that we have already made to the Paris Agreement previously. And so that includes the US States Climate Alliance, in which half of the states have agreed to take leadership, including Minnesota, where we are based, as well as the We Are Still In Coalition, which includes thousands of businesses, cities and counties, local governments, colleges and universities and other institutions, hospitals and healthcare organizations, faith groups, states, and tribal nations who are all committed to continuing to work towards our national goals in the absence of federal leadership. So again, going back to the Paris Agreement, almost 200 nations have signed to that. And despite the US's notice of withdrawal, that will go into effect almost a year from now without other action interrupting that withdrawal. We still have commitments made by local actors across sectors that can make up our national contribution towards achieving those goals. And so that is the sector that we will be part of at COP25. So again, this is the 25th annual conference where countries this year have already committed to some targets as part of the Paris Agreement, and this year are really being called on to increase those goals. We have an incredible public movement across the globe calling for urgent action, and a lot of the commitments that countries have previously made can be increased to more ambitious levels. And so that is something that we look forward to supporting this year as countries are finalizing the rule book on how they will continue to report on their emissions targets as the Paris Agreement comes into an implementation phase. And again, going back to my climate story, the theme that Climate Generation is really trying to uplift this year is immigration, climate-related displacement, and the Paris Agreement includes a commitment to uphold human rights in its preamble, knowing that there are so many different intersections of climate change and human rights, social justice, and the way that our communities experience those every day. And here in the US, we have an incredible border crisis that is really directly linked with climate change. And those are some stories that we're going to be working to uplift at this year's COP. So again, originally, Chile was going to host this year's COP. And part of the reason that COP moves to a different country every year is to enable civil society participation. We know that environmental justice requires the participation and meaningful contributions of everybody in order to create policies that really reflect what our communities need. And so obviously it's very hard to travel the world to go to conferences in different locations. So the conference travels to hear from people in different regions of the world to try and be more accessible. However, because of the conflicts in Chile that are also very clearly connected to climate change, ironically, the conference has been moved to Spain this year. And so we will be in Madrid with Chile maintaining the presidency, which means that they will oversee the negotiations throughout the year and work that is done by the UNFCCC. So despite being relocated, those issues are still going to be uplifted. For example, this photo it's not only in Chile, this is conflicts that are being experienced in many different regions. This photo is from Ecuador, which also recently had a national emergency when they raised the price of gas, despite continuing to provide subsidies to fossil fuel industries in the country. And so having the low-income communities shouldering the burden of these climate change solutions is not, it's a false solution. This is not going to be what we really need to be promoting as we work together towards these emissions reductions. And so the Paris Agreement commitment to human rights acknowledges that that all of these impacts are incredibly intersectional, and that parties, when undertaking actions to address climate change, must consider those obligations across those intersectional impacts as well. So as we are uplifting the theme of climate migration, part of that is really recognizing the specific ways in which the climate crisis is fueling migration and displacement. So we know that there are a wide variety of impacts, from droughts to flash floods, food shortages, and land impacts that are deeply affecting people, especially those who rely on the land more closely. And so we're seeing migration happening across the world when those lands are becoming inhabitable or are no longer sustaining people's lifestyles. So especially those with the least amount of resources are unable to adapt to those changing climates. And again, this is a quote from 350.org, is one of our partners. We are seeing that migrants are being forced out of their homes due to rising sea levels, are fleeing their countries in search of refuge and safety from violence that is associated with climate disaster. And that is happening across different regions. As just a short clip of news releases will show, this is affecting people everywhere. And so specifically here in the US, we have a majority of folks who are crossing the southern US border are coming from South and Central America, in large part due to the extreme drought in Central America, where a lot of rural communities are losing their economic stability. They're losing their ability to farm the land and to support their families, and so have been forced to seek more opportunities up in the US, but instead are being put in cages. And so communities of color, Indigenous communities and Latino communities are experiencing the highest rates of exposure to pollution from greenhouse gas emitting industries. They're on the front lines of climate change, receiving the highest burdens. And after extreme weather events, have also been shouldering the burden of contracting for cleanup, where they're exposed to heavily toxic debris. And so at the same time, we see polling in which Latino communities in the US report the highest rates of understanding the reality of the climate crisis and the highest rates of taking action and taking leadership on climate change. We see displacement in the US as well. This is a global problem. We have Indigenous communities on the front line of climate action after generations of experiencing fossil fuel extraction through their nations, who are again being forced from their homelands due to climate change and displacement, with just a few examples, photos from different communities there. And so again, we know that all of us are eyewitnesses to the impacts of climate change and our experience, and ultimately every state is going to experience climate-related displacement if we continue along this path. Our communities are being affected in very different ways across the country, whether you're being displaced by wildfires in California and the West Coast, by drought in the South, by flooding and extreme weather in the Midwest, by hurricanes along the coast. Everyone is eyewitness to extremely large impacts of climate change, and not just through those significant and extreme weather events, but through our everyday experiences. So Climate Generation is coordinating more than 30 Minnesotans who will be in COP this year from across various sectors. Hello to anyone who's watching, who's part of that crew. Our goals will be to amplify those voices from frontline leaders who are experiencing those changes here in Minnesota, as well as folks who are leading on solutions in Minnesota to elevate that incredible work at the global level, as well as bringing home lessons that we learn from our partners across the world back home to Minnesota to address those intersectional solutions, and specifically how we can be a part of the solution for climate-related displacement. And so we invite everyone to follow our delegation. We'll have social media, we'll have daily digests through our Window into COP program. So we'll be having more of these webinars live from Madrid during the COP25, and we'll be bringing some partners who are part of those discussions to join us to share those stories and what we're hearing at those events. We'll be sharing daily blogs and updates as we participate in activities and conversations there, and sharing summaries that you can share with your own communities and audiences in classrooms. So some of the dates that are scheduled. This is during the second week in negotiations. It's a 2-week process. And we have another Clean Network webinar for next month, as well as 2 additional public webinars and a classroom targeted webinar, including a reading discussion. We'll also have events here in community for those near us here in Minnesota, and other ways to engage as we go. I would like to invite any questions from participants about our programming or about the work that we're doing in our theme this year.
Any questions out there? Thanks for joining us over lunch.
And feel free to type any questions in the chat box as well, or you can follow up by email, sarah@climategen.org, and again, follow us at climategen.org/COP25.
Get the digest. Awesome. Well, if there's no questions, then have a lovely day, and we hope to have you subscribing to the digest and joining us for our further webinars. We have one tomorrow night on how to use our educator toolkit, and then you'll be seeing Sarah live from Madrid in just a few weeks. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you.